Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Southern Education Foundation's webinar on the white paper, Navigating the New Normal, Financial Imperatives for MSI Effectiveness and Avoiding Financial Exigency. First, what we want to do today is to go through a number of slides and presentations. Given the size of the brief that is the impetus behind this presentation or this webinar is rather lengthy, we'll try to get through a majority of the topics that were in the brief, and we will answer some of your questions. We'll take about 45 minutes to go through the slides, and then hopefully we will have some time for questions that you guys will probably put forward. Well, on the next slide, you'll see just a brief overview or a look at the issues that we see facing our HBCUs and HSIs as we go into this, what we call now the new normal. And inside the new normal, you will see a term called financial exigency, which is not used quite a bit, but it's still something that's relevant for us today. Financial exigency basically is a growing concern amongst many MSI stakeholders, and in some instances dominating headlines. And what it basically is a situation where an institution finds itself where it cannot meet its obligations. And the term financial exigency is a formal term where an institution declares financial exigency because of that fact. So one of the things that you'll see, and we've been seeing over the course of the last 6 months to a year, is that some of our institutions have either merged without even declaring financial exigency, and some have just straight out closed. It disrupts the lives of both the students, the faculty, and staff. And quite recently, at least one institution we know of had closed, and one is scheduled to close sometime early in the spring. So as we go through and we look at what's happening here, is a mixed bag of what's causing some of our issues. We saw last week where one institution sent home approximately 645 students because of their lack of ability to pay. And we also saw where another institution reported that it had a $7 million hole in its budget. And we're also seeing a situation whereby institutions are now going into the fall enrollment and are having to extend their enrollment deadlines into after the post-Labor Day, and maybe to some extent even some are still doing it today. So therefore, we're seeing that we're being reactionary, and that's not necessarily where we want to be as institutions. We're also seeing on the horizon where very, very seasoned leaders have announced their retirement. At Xavier and at Houston-Tillotson, for example, we have seen that those presidents will be leaving in June of 2015. So there is a mixture of things that are going on, and we just wanted to spend some time going through some of these issues. On the next slide, we'll briefly talk about the challenges that MSIs are facing. Now, I will hasten to say that MSIs are not the only ones that are going through this issue. This issue is pretty much something that's standard across the U.S. for small to medium-sized liberal arts institutions. But last year was a year for HBCUs and HSIs in particular because of the demographic that they serve. And as we looked at the changes made to the Parent Plus loan situation, it heavily impacted the HSI and HBCU communities, where we saw somewhere in the neighborhood of about $150 million being erased in terms of loans being made available. So once the Parent Plus situation has kind of hit some sort of a reprieve, where the Department of Education recently announced that it's going to look at a stopgap measure or a temporary fix. Will not get back to where it was prior to the change, but the change or the fix kicks in fiscal year 2015-2016. That's a year out, and that does not address necessarily what these institutions are going to face for this current year of 14-15. In addition to the Parent Plus loan changes, we also have for our state institution, you have legislated mandated budget cuts whereby states are having issues with their revenues as well, and with competing interests states are having to cut back on higher education to some extent, and the higher education institutions or colleges and universities that are state-funded are the ones that are necessarily being impacted. We're also seeing from a state level as well tuition increase caps that have been put in place, and several states have gone forward and put those changes into play. Those impact institutions as well, and I would dare say MSIs and HSIs that are publicly funded, they are pretty much in that category. One of the areas that broadens the spectrum and impacts pretty much everyone is the expanded student choice. And what that basically means is that students of today have more options to attend college and universities. From the minority and the black and brown communities, they're seeing also where they're being heavily wooed by majority institutions that have the ability to offer scholarships and almost, in some instances, no loan packages by using their endowments as a backstop for these students. An interesting article came out just about August the 14th that talked about the fact comparing Pomona College and Swarthmore College, two elite institutions, and in that comparison, they basically were trying to see what a minority student, family income of $30,000 or less, would pay to attend those institutions. And one of the most interesting things that came out of the article was, for me, was looking at it from the standpoint that a person that family's income is less than $30,000 has the ability to attend these institutions for $2,751 and $10,973 respectively. How do MSIs compete with that when there are smaller endowments? Alumni giving and base fundraising is not as robust as one would think, but how do they compete with that situation? That's something that students are having to debate and wrestle with because they have many options that are afforded to them. So therefore, our HBCUs and HSIs are a pipeline of students that automatically in years past would have come to our institutions. They have many, many other options at this point. Also impacting is demographic shifts. If you look at what's happening, one of the things we discovered while doing the work for the brief was in the communities where the college-age student is growing, they also happen to be the areas in which those students are challenged socioeconomically, Pell Grant eligible, and for lack of a better word, they might be poor. But not only is socioeconomic factors at play here, we have a situation where the demographics in terms of where the pipeline is growing, stable, or decreasing, and you can see primarily from what researchers are putting forward, the Northeast is seeing a decrease in its college pipeline, whereas the South and going out towards the West is stable to increasing. So how do institutions that are geographically spread all across the United States attract students to their campuses? Given both the socioeconomic factors just mentioned, the racial factors just mentioned, how do HSIs and MSIs still compete at that same level? And then lastly, we have the for-profit colleges that are now, and I would dare say community colleges, that competition is also grave. We have an example of one community college out in Arizona, Rio Salado Community College, where they're offering students in 46 other states outside of Arizona online classes at triple the price. So if we don't have a backbone, or HSIs and HBCUs don't have a backbone in terms of information technology structure and things of that nature, how do you compete with an institution that's already out there and down the road? So things are coming forward and coming full circle. On the next slide, we'll take a look at what's happening is a greater increased focus is on the Parent Plus loans. I mentioned that before in the previous slide, but we want to elaborate on it a little bit here, for the simple fact that the Parent Plus loan is one of the more available vehicles in the past for students and parents to allow their children to matriculate at an institution. So once that was pulled back, there were some challenges that were there. But what's interesting is with the the temporary measure that came forward about a week or two ago from the Department of Education, one of the things that still is there that's not really looked at is whether or not parents are even want to borrow these funds going forward because of the economic climate that we're currently in. So we still have parents that might refuse to utilize these loans, and that's something our HBCUs and MSIs, they're going to have to manage and take a look at prospectively moving forward. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about enrolling low-income students of color. What is interesting is, from the statistics that we're seeing from the Department of Education and others, black borrowers or African-American students, when they borrow, they usually typically owe about 22% more on their loans, have defaulted on approximately 11% of more loans, and they're in non-payment on roughly 60% more of their undergraduate debt compared with our Caucasian brothers and sisters. So what that also plays into is what impact that has on the Title IV, especially when default rates go very, very high. And students in and of themselves can borrow more than they actually need for the sticker price that is at the institution. There is a concept called the cost of education, which is a little bit more than the tuition and fee price tag that's there. So what happens more often than not is students will have the ability, based upon what's called their estimated family contribution scores, to borrow more than they actually need. And in essence, students end up with refunds, and they utilize those refunds for various and sundry needs, living expenses, etc. But what needs to be kept in mind is that these students, those funds have to be repaid, and those are folded into an overall default rate for the institution. So if they're borrowing more than they need and are challenged in that regard, how do they then come back and repay those funds? One of the more interesting programs that's inside the Title IV programming from the federal government is the Perkins Loans Program. The Perkins Loan Program is more like an impressed program among students that are current and students that have already graduated. So students who have graduated typically will have to repay, so students that are currently in the pipeline have access to those funds to matriculate themselves. However, with the economy being the way it is, a weak job market, we're seeing whereby the Perkins programs, they probably are rising faster than most would want to see in terms of their default rate. And quite honestly, that also creates problems for an institution because there's a very, very heavy administrative burden to keep up with the program and make sure the program is running efficiently. About 2 or 3 years ago, when the Affordable Care Act was going through Congress, an interesting situation occurred in that institutions started looking at the Perkins program because of a small notation in the bill that was going through. And as they were going through, CFOs and other university and administrative leaders discovered that it was probably too much of a burden to continue with that program, and actually some opted out of it. So as we're going through, we're seeing where students and their ability to borrow, but more so the ability to repay, is something that is going to be impacting going forward. Another challenge that is there is our recruiting cycle at HBCUs and MSIs are going longer into the semesters. So, for example, we're right on the tail end of registration for the fall, and you will probably be seeing students and their parents having to set up payment plans and try to manage the payment plans over the course of a semester and over the course of a year. Well, if you look at the news last week from the institution that had to send home some students, the primary reason behind sending them home is they were not able to meet obligations that they had set up in payment plans. And some of those payment plans basically span 2 fiscal years. So you can see that's another indicator that the challenges of where our students and their parents are having, even if they get onto payment plans, they're having issues and challenges to make those payments. So the student debt also is something that is going to be looked at in the context of the variables on this slide, in that right now the total student debt in the United States has topped approximately $1 trillion. And everyone has in their own mindset that this cannot continue because it will be the next bubble that will burst. There are much more smarter people than I know that are out there, but that is something that everyone needs to keep their eyes on. So as we look at MSIs on the next slide, you will see that most of the MSIs, especially some of our HBCUs, they are either small college with a low tuition or a small college with a high tuition based on the Noah Levitt's definition. And really what happens in this context is brand name of institutions play a role. And you would see anywhere from state institutions that have tuition that are down in the low teens to more research-based larger institutions that are somewhere in the mid-40s. So this mixed bag, as you go back and forth and looking at it, you can definitely see that the institutions that make up our MSI family, especially some of our HBCUs, they are within this bandwidth. So if you look at it from right now where things stand, even if our students are coming in and they are either in a small college, low tuition, or small college, high tuition, the challenges around enrolling our students and having them be financially viable for a full academic year presents challenges that has to be understood in the context of each campus, of each mission, and of each strategic plan that is going forward. So on the next slide, we could talk a little bit about what we see further in enrolling low-income students of color. And the top measures were something that I think I need to just read. In the absence of a large endowment, is it difficult for many MSIs to generate enough scholarship dollars to assist their students in enrolling each academic year? I read that because it has to be underscored. For example, if we took a look at the top 10 majority institutions and their endowments, it's approximately $154.7 billion. If you were to take the top 10 HBCUs, that total is $1.5 billion. But here's something that's really, really interesting. If we were to look at the top 5 HBCUs, that would include, in terms of endowment, that will include Howard University, Spelman College, Meharry Medical College, Hampton University, and Florida A&M University. Combined from the most recent report, those 5 account for $1.3 billion of the $1.5. That's 87% of the value of portfolios. So if that is the case, how do MSIs compete with majority institutions for scholarship dollars when a majority of their endowments are less than $100 million? And this is something that is being looked at majority institutions in terms of growing the endowment, not only in perpetuity, but also to have spin-off to assist with enrolling students and have them matriculate through the course of the year. But this isn't the HBCUs and MSIs in general, they do not have a strong endowment that will fund the student aid that the students need to enroll. So if they don't have the endowments there giving us dollars to enroll the students, what we're seeing is that we are doing what's called tuition discounting with unfunded aid. The aid that comes from an endowment or annual fundraising campaigns are what we call funded aid, and that brings to the institution much needed cash. However, unfunded aid does not bring cash to the institution. So the more that you increase unfunded aid, the concept of net tuition revenue that has to be positive or growing in order to balance a budget or to have operating dollar cash or to have cash for capital projects, that has to also be growing. So in essence, it's the slide below, the tenet below basically says for incoming freshman students, the rate is typically higher than the upperclassmen. And that is done in order to attract students to the institution. But as they attract students to the institution, you're basically seeing a situation where schools are collecting almost 50 cents on the tuition dollar. But the budget still has to be balanced against this lower number. So if I am modeling out and I'm trying to understand the financial impacts of what can be for our institutions, it's very, very difficult if the discount rate keeps moving. When the Parent Plus loan situation came around, a number of institutions did exactly this by discounting to keep enrollment stable and steady, but at the same time, the net impact upon the campuses, one can say, basically caused it to be challenged. So as we look at the next slide, you will see a kind of played out in a different format where typically high sticker price is usually used to signify quality. Most of the elite institutions, their sticker prices are way up there, as everyone knows. But what also is interesting is that they assist many of their students to attend by way of financial aid, be it funded aid, unfunded aid. But once you remove that aid, you now have the institutional percentage that's discounted to attend. So when you think about the example I shared before with Pomona and Swarthmore, I will also add to that Harvard University, where students that are in that lower socioeconomic bracket, they can also attend institutions for $4,000, $5,000 compared to our institutions, or HBCUs and HSIs, that pretty much need close to full-paying students in order to meet budget. So you can clearly see that the competition is very, 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 very stiff. A majority of institutions as well, as we look at enrolling our students into our institutions, is that majority institutions are also trying to diversify their population for the simple fact that as the pipeline I mentioned before continues to grow, what everyone is pretty much seeing is that students of color are starting to be the ones to come into the pipeline, and you have to attract them in order to keep the profile and the quality of your institution going. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about tuition modeling. And in tuition modeling, it's really just to get a sense of what will happen in terms of enrollment for your campus on an annualized basis, and then extend it out for 5 years. And the variables each year can be plus or minus a number of students, plus or minus the percentage that you'll add to or subtract from discounted aid. So what you'll see is our net tuition revenue is that big number, big important number that trustees, senior administrators have to keep their eyes on. If we continue to bring students in and we have our enrollment on campus looks fine, but however the finances of the enrollment is what we need to keep our eyes on. So right now, as we are looking at what's happening, our annual tuition charges, which is the top line of the institutions, it's going up higher than the rate of inflation. In recent weeks, or recent years, institutions have been trying to get the annual tuition charges that are less than the rate of inflation. And hopefully that will be something that can be managed going forward. However, at many institutions, or some institutions rather, you are seeing where headcount is something individuals are focused on. Well, a budget and your annual tuition charges are not necessarily based upon headcount. It's based upon full-time equivalents for credit hours that will be earned. That is a very, very important concept to understand when looking at the annual tuition charges from revenue, because some of our institutions, or a good number of our institutions, have part-time students. So it's not so much of a head count of a body of an individual, but it's the revenue that's going to be generated from the FTEs of the students attending the institution. And as I mentioned before, tuition discounting and institutional aid is then subtracted from that, and then we end up with this concept of net tuition revenue. And that net tuition revenue for a majority of our institutions, or MSIs, is primary to balancing the budget. As we move to the next slide, I'd like to mention that as you're listening in and you'd like to leave questions, you can look off to the right in the right corner of the screen, and you can type in a question, and I will try to get to answering it before we end this afternoon. The next slide talks about tuition modeling and kind of in a graphic, so to speak. So if you look, you'll see tuition charges and full-time student enrollment FTEs on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, you'll see tuition discounting and institutional aid, economic recession, and changes in federal aid and state aid. So if you look, as I mentioned previously, the full-time student enrollment take into account part-time students that are currently at the institution, that has to have an impact upon your net tuition revenue and what you'll have in terms of cash coming into the institution. And the institution actually controls, on this whole chart, the institution only controls two variables, the tuition that it charges and the tuition discounting and institutional aid that it offers. It does not control whether or not a student attends the institution full-time or part-time, and it doesn't include the economy, and it doesn't control, the changes in federal and state aid. So as tuition modeling goes forward, certain assumptions have to be made that are not necessarily things that are easily manipulated or controlled. So to those variables, oftentimes, our institutions are always reactionary rather than having a plan going forward, because that cannot be managed at the institutional level. So on the next slide, I'll share with you a sample of what, this is just an example of what a tuition net modeling exercise might look like. And what we're doing here is comparing 3 fiscal years. We're looking at an institution that's $27,000 in its base year. It increases to $27,177, $27,556. But what's interesting is the tuition discounting percentage. You're seeing that number move up, 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 whereas you're seeing the head count goes up, you're seeing the part-time student go up. So all of these variables all come into play to answer a simple question. Can I generate enough revenue on the top side of my tuition and fees and have that netted with institutional aid and still produce enough revenue that will bring the institution cash in order to operate? So everyone will probably look at the top line gross tuition revenue and say, hey, that's great. We're at $20 million, $20.6 million, and $21.2 million. But the net effect to the budget that's needed to balance and run the institution for the year is really the number net tuition revenue, $15 million, $15.1, and $15.2. That's a concept that oftentimes is not necessarily understood. Now, at most of our HBCUs and HSIs, we will wait until after the Labor Day and things like that to allow students to sort out their finances. And then if we get down to the end, our upperclassmen will wait. They play the waiting game to some extent, and then see if the institution is going to increase the number of aid that it provides so that they can then have be able to afford the experience. But presidents, trustees, and CFOs, I might add, need to really be mindful of the fact that as you do that, you might be necessarily hurting the institution in terms of net tuition revenue. On the next slide, we'll talk quickly about fundraising. Fundraising is a key element for many of our institutions today. One thing the Great Recession taught us all in 2008, 2009 is how heavily dependent institutions are on fundraising. And typically in a normal setting, one would always want to grow their endowment and have that there, so in perpetuity, scholarships, professorships, and things of that nature will be able to be provided. However, as we look at the challenges that institutions have today, a more utopian concept seems to be coming out that they need cash now to spend, and that's unrestricted fundraising. Fundraising that is not restricted by neither time nor purpose is what institutions need right now. Scholarship support is probably secondary in nature because scholarship support allows for the institution to be able to have gap funding, and that gap funding provides for an institution to help students to bridge and come over the hump, so to speak, in order to enroll for a year. But, you know, MSIs are competing against a dynamic that is very, very interesting because they have smaller alumni bases. The endowment in and of itself is smaller, and institutional advancement offices probably are not as robust as majority institutions. For example, just yesterday, a graduate of Harvard University gave a gift of $350 million to Harvard for research and things of that nature. He got his master's and PhD from Harvard, and now is returning to the school, $350 million. And that's not uncommon to see at majority institutions. So we have to ask ourselves, what donors do MSIs have that can give at that level? So the competition is just as strong, is stronger, but it's also growing. So how do MSIs and MSIs in general compete in that arena? So the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about one of the things that is very, very important that I have learned over the course of 2 summers now teaching at the Southern Education Foundation's MSI and Governance and Effectiveness Conference, is a composite financial index primarily driven by the annual calculations that have to be done for the Department of Education. This is something that cannot be overlooked, and it has to be understood primarily by our trustees, presidents, chief financial officers pretty much are aware of it for the simple fact that it has to be calculated each year. But going to the conferences, I was kind of taken aback by the questions that I was being asked, and I was being asked about, well, what exactly is that? That question in and of itself was interesting because this is one of the key variables and key ratios that have to be monitored on an ongoing basis in order to get your hands around it. So if you look at the Composite Financial Index score, it's a very, very simple calculation that has to be made. And if the institution is trying to get to a score of 1.5 or greater, if the institution does not get a 1.5 or greater, but is it within a bandwidth of, say, 1 to 1.5, they'll probably incur some attention from the Department of Education, and they might be placed on something called reimbursement. And reimbursement is something that many of our institutions, HSIs and HBCUs, really don't need at this juncture because it disrupts cash flow and it causes problems in terms of meeting obligations in a timely manner. But if they are below a score of 1, there is a possibility that they would lose Title IV accreditation. And losing Title IV accreditation is almost a death sentence in some instances for some institutions. We can see that from institutions that have lost their accreditation over time and as a result have lost their ability to participate in the Title IV funding program. So this is something that is very, very important, and this is a key indicator that trustees and senior leaders have to be able to understand, calculate, and use as tools for strategic planning, and also to look and assess how institutions are performing on a financial basis. Well, what we want to do on the next slide and here on out towards the end, and I'd like to remind you, if you do have questions, you can type your questions into the boxes, and I will try to respond to them as quickly as possible towards the end of this presentation. But on this slide, what we want to do in going forward is talk simply about the practical steps for board and administrators, because at the end of the day, as you leave this call, our hope and our goal is that you will be able to be equipped with a couple of scenarios or a couple of questions that, as the ultimate fiduciaries of these institutions, a la the trustees, that you understand some of the questions and things that you probably should be asking. One of the things that's very, very critical, and especially for institutions throughout, but I would dare say for institutions that are in the southeastern portion of the United States and under the auspices of the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, is the value of your unrestricted net assets net of plant and plant-related debt. And what basically this is doing is it is trying to ascertain the value of the net assets, or if you're a for-profit-minded individual, the equity of the institution that is free and clear of obligations. In other words, you would not have to sell portions of your campus in order to meet payments for current bills. So if you look, for example, this is something that is continuing to grow for the simple fact that institutions are seeing themselves in that they're still borrowing. Just last week it came out that nationwide approximately $425 million in new debt placements took place. And those debt placements primarily were for infrastructure, refinancing, and residence halls and things of that nature. But most debt is being taken out for revenue-producing enterprises, buildings, dormitories, and so on. If institutions are going into debt, to really just build upon non-revenue producing students, and the tuition and fees that you're getting from students are what's primarily driving the cash flows to make those payments. That also adds additional pressure and stress to the institution. If this number on a year-over-year basis, the value therein, is falling year to year, trustees, administrators, and others, I think, really would have to step up and ask themselves the question, is the institution growing in terms of its equity year over year, or is it challenged financially so that it is eating into its equity just to stay afloat, just to operate? That's a very, very challenging question to ask, but is one that has to be addressed and has to be managed. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about fundraising and the context of fundraising. And in the budget, fundraising always is a key aspect of an MSI's operations. However, in the current environment, it's the type of fundraising that is going to also assist. Scholarships, so that, as you mentioned before, is needed, but if there's always the ability to get unrestricted funds, that's even better. So one of the things that trustees and others need to be mindful of and ask themselves is, are the goals that are set for annualized fundraising, are they realistic? If I'm inside a capital campaign, if I'm outside of a capital campaign, especially if I'm using the value of or the ability of the institution to raise funds to balance the budget and meet payments. If they're not able to do that, we will then have to ask ourselves the question, what is a realistic number? Because putting in an unrealistic number for fundraising will challenge the institution in ways that they didn't expect. And it's always easier to manage the operational aspects rather than to simply try to figure out if a donor is going to make good on a pledge. So that is one thing that we wanted to make sure that is known. And also that's driven primarily by the simple fact that institutional advancement staff, they have to be very seasoned, very, very well-rounded, and also have a sense of where they're going in terms of their annual plans. So it's very, very important in this context, especially where we are today, because if enrollment is falling and net tuition revenue is also falling, the fallback position is annualized fundraising. And some way, somehow, engagement of alumni, friends, donors of all stripes are needed. On the next slide, just a little bit, just wanted to answer a couple of quick questions. And the quick questions are, what is the size of the unrestricted endowment at the institution? That's something that has to be looked at and understood in context, because if an endowment is heavily restricted and it's only for scholarships and professorships and things of that nature, that's good. In one instance, for the simple fact that you are helping students and you actually might be paying and covering the salaries for professors and so on and so forth. But at the same time, as we mentioned before, we want to make sure that unrestricted access to funds is always the best thing that institutions need at this time. What is the spend rate from the endowment on an annual basis? What is the methodology utilized? Trustees and other leaders need to understand that as well, because of the simple fact that they are the ones that's going to set the policy for the spend. They are the ones that are going to have to understand how the institution is going to manage the funds that come back from the endowment. Are we using the banded model? Are we using the Yale model? Or are we using a trailing average model? Those are some of the questions trustees need to understand, and understand what cash is going to be spun off from the actual funds that have been assigned, so to speak, from the portfolio. Is the portfolio spend policy, is it in line with MIFA? Does it meet the standards and tenets of the recently passed MIFA laws and the flexibility thereon? Even though that law has been passed for many, I guess at least 2 or 3 years now, you still find questions coming up about whether or not a spend rate is reasonable or not. That's something trustees need to be mindful of. Number 5, what are the tenets of the bond covenants that must be met each year from annual operations? That is, what goals has the institution promised to meet to satisfy MSIs covenants. Questions that should come from that simply revolve around, what are the debt burden ratio? What is my debt capacity? And can I continue to borrow? What does that do to my overall debt burden? And also, in my operating budget, am I able to cover the servicing of the debt on an annualized basis? It's not something that is set aside far and away from the portfolio in and of itself, but what it does is you have to understand it in the context of what does it do to the operating budget if my debt servicing is rising faster than my ability to grow net tuition revenue. On the next slide, we wanted to talk a little bit about what Board of Trustees need to understand. We talked quite a bit about the tuition discounting. What does it look like? How much is enough? Where does that position the institution? What does net tuition revenue look like? Well, typically, it is a bifurcation between your entering freshman and your continuing student. So how much is the rate for the freshman coming in? Is it a fixed rate, or does the rate grow over time? Or is it, when I compare that with what I'm giving to the upperclassmen, what is the total picture? The total picture gives you what can be construed as the blended discount rate. And that discount rate, when applied to the overall strategies that are employed by the institution, will be the major factor that gets you to your net tuition revenue. So that's very, very important. On the next slide, just a couple of more questions that just wanted to make sure I raise here. What is the Composite Financial Index score, and what are the purposes of the Department of Education Financial Responsibility Test? The Composite Financial Index score is really a combination of approximately 5 variables. They include things like your net income ratio, your equity ratio, and the primary reserve ratio. Those are some of the major ones. And inside that ratio, which is easily calculated by any chief financial officer or controller, then is put into a matrix and assigned certain predetermined weights that the Department of Education assigned to each ratio. Out of those predetermined rates, then you will get a number, and that number kicks you down to your actual score. The score is anywhere, you want to have a score that's 1.5 or higher. If we're not getting 1.5 or higher and we're falling down into a 1 to 1.5, I would dare say trustees and presidents and senior leaders need to ask themselves the question, how do we get back to the other side? What things do we have to put in place in order to make sure that we address this issue? Because if it continues to slide, and the Composite Financial Index usually does not happen or falls off in a one-year cycle. And the reason why that's the case is simply because in this calculation, it includes both your unrestricted and your temporarily restricted net assets. Whereas, for example, the net assets, net of plant and plant-related debt, does not include temp restricted. So it takes a more holistic look at the operations of the institution. But if the institution is faltering along that line, then something needs to be brought to bear, some conversations need to be had, because the institution needs to address it. Just quickly going through the rest of the questions here. What is the debt level institution, and how much is paid out annually towards the debt? I think I mentioned that before. And how much institutional aid is funded or unfunded? That is critical, because funded aid brings cash to the institution. Unfunded aid, or simply discounting the price for students to come in, can hurt the institution's cash flow if it's not managed properly against the budget. How many lines of credit are being accessed by the institutions? Many of our institutions in this regard utilize summer funds to access lines of credit for cash flow purposes. But one of the things we need to always bear in mind, a higher education institution, regardless of size, that is heavily tuition dependent, it gets its resources twice a year, either late August, early September, late January, early February. The intervening months, the college or university operates on a declining balance basis. So institutions need to know, once that number is set at the beginning of the semester, I pretty much have that for the rest of the semester. And because I am budgeting based on full-time equivalents, as I do my budget, I'm also looking at an average amongst the semester for those full-time equivalents. So it will be erroneous to take your full-time equivalents from the fall and then say that's going to be the same in the spring, because you have attrition between the semesters. So that's something that's very, very important that they have to understand. So accessing those lines of credit helps over the summer months when cash flow is least. But as you access a line of credit, as you build a budget and go into the fiscal year, as you're getting your funds, those funds have to be repaid and put into the budget so that they are covered. So you really have 12 months worth of fiscal activities for the entire fiscal year. The last question on this slide is, what are the substantial issues raised by the auditors? Each year your auditors are going to give you what is called a management letter. And that management letter, if you have no findings, great. But if you do have findings, those management letter comments really need to come into your annualized plan for the next year. If it's a longer-term issue, you should then really be looking at it over a 2 to 5 year period. But most of the findings that you will see, especially if they're related to what's called internal controls, they should be remedied in the next fiscal year. So that then becomes part of your plan. On the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about just enrollment strategies and what boards and administrators at MSIs have to really wrestle with on a prospective basis. They really need to create an enrollment strategy that takes into consideration the changing demographics in the United States and the ability of the students to pay. There was an interesting article, I believe it was last week, that came out in the New York Times that spoke about the fact that many of the poorer minority students are still not being enrolled in elite colleges as some would have liked, at the pace and the rate that some would have liked. But if you take that and you really pull it back and ask yourself this question, more and more of our students lack the ability to pay. Just go and look at last week's decision by one institution. And I dare say there's some institutions that we will see more probably come out, because we have to also understand, trustees and others, that the funds drawn from the federal government really are not necessarily owned 100% by the institution until mid-October or somewhere around there, for the simple reason that if a student withdraws after registering, after enrolling, and they leave the institution, the funds that were drawn on behalf of that student have to be returned to the federal government. There's a process called an R2T4, return to Title IV. So if you're waiting until October to really get a sense of what the cash flows will be and the ultimate revenues will be, understanding whether or not students are going to be able to pay is something that's very critical, because if they're on payment plans and they lack the ability to pay, when we do our financial statements at the end of the year, you will have revenue booked and other aspects booked, but the cash to meet bills, to pay bills and do whatever, you will not have on your hand. So whatever the enrollment strategy is, especially at HBCUs and MSIs, is where courage is going to have to kick in, and folks are going to have to ask themselves really this simple question: can the students I attract pay? Moving quickly, the next slide, just some simple things: hire a qualified and experienced business analyst to assist with enrollment management. Your admissions office and your financial aid office are your two most critical offices for getting your enrollment seated. You need to make sure that they're staffed with qualified people that understand the nuances of where we are today and how we're dealing with some of these issues. Your financial aid office is akin to your bank. Your monies to operate your institution from a tuition standpoint, which is the majority of the revenue for our institutions, MSIs, your financial aid office is your bank. So those folks, the financial aid director, it would be great if that individual has a statistical background and can do some ongoing professional development as well. On the next slide, really we just want to mention real quickly that understanding the cash flow needs of the institution is to shape the institutional aid. I think I've said quite a bit on the institutional aid, on its importance, and how it has to be addressed, how it has to be shaped. But if I am having cash flow issues, one of the things you'll hear CFOs say to everyone on campus is we have to track the due to, due froms. And we have to track that because if I'm using a singular account for my checking, I have restricted dollars and everything flowing through that account. So I have to make sure my sources and uses of funds is known so I know exactly what I can do in terms of institutional aid and I can provide for students, but at the same time to make sure that funds stay in their appropriate funds or their accounts, so to speak. So that is very, very important. On the next slide, in the area of fundraising, I think this one is very, very self-explanatory, is that you need to engage with professionals. Where higher ed finds itself right now is that fundraising is going to become key. But with so many institutions, over 4,000 plus, including community colleges and everything else, you're going to find situations where everybody's engaged in a campaign, they're ending a campaign, or they're about to go into a campaign. So how does the Institution Advancement Office set its annual goals and then set also capital campaign goals? Fundraising analysts and market analysis is always needed, and there are many, many fundraising consultants out here that can assist with that. On the next slide, just real quickly, as we move quickly to the end, timeline for board reviews of audit opinions and things like that. This is very, very important for trustees to understand because they have to sign off on the audits. They have to basically put their stamp of approval on the audits. And if they're doing so, there's a timeline that has to be met. So, for example, if you're a June 30th auditee, your OMB Circular A13 audit is due by March 31st of the succeeding year. If you're May 31st, it's February 28th, and you can keep backing the dates up accordingly. The IRS Form 90, which went through a major revamp about 2 years ago, that's due every year, but because we operate on a fiscal year and that report operates on a calendar year, there is an built-in intrinsic one-year lag, and that one-year lag basically is something that the board has to understand the timing for when it should be filed. Typically, they're due in October of each year, but most institutions will file an extension that will get them over to the May of the succeeding year. One audit that's not on this list that also trustees need to be mindful of is the 403 plan audits. That's something that is coming down the pike as well, but understanding that is going to be very, very important, especially for trustees as they go forward. On the next slide, real quickly, just to follow up a little bit on the institutional advancement, they need to really be trained in the hierarchy of fundraising. And basically what that means is understanding how to make requests for gifts. Big gifts equals big money. Getting donors, what I call molasses donors, who will continue to give slow and steady, getting them excited around all the tenets and all the things of fundraising in this environment is going to be very, very important. And institutional advancement staff need to be trained and work very closely with the budget office so everyone can understand that these are the targets that are in the budget that we have to meet so that they'll have a target to work towards. Because automatically, if a budget is balanced with a significant amount of unrestricted fundraising, there might be challenges in balancing the budget, because if those fundraising targets are missed, it's very difficult midstream or towards the end of the year to make up that difference. And then the last point that I'll raise on this slide is that, there are a number of seasoned financial officers that are out there, and they will help the institutions to do what they have to do. So contact them. There are myriad and any number of them that are out there that are at institutions, and we can go from there. And ladies and gentlemen, that actually ends The last slide just talks about knowing where our cash flow projections might be at the end of the year for restricted resources that I'd mentioned before. So therefore, in the last couple of minutes that we have, I see one or two questions that came through, and I think I've answered at least 2 or 3 of them already. So I'll just try to answer the last couple that are here, and that will take us to the end of this webinar. The question is, Mr. Hector, a very timely presentation. You talked about the importance of institution advancement having a clear understanding. What does admissions play in advertising these potential challenges? What role does admissions play? Admissions play a key role because admissions actually is bringing in the students to the institution that will be the lion's share of the budget for the institution on a prospective basis. If our admissions office is not up to par and they're not necessarily bringing in the students and enrollment targets are being missed on a consistent basis, year after year, the institution will go through what I call fits and starts. And those fits and starts is that we might have built out a nice 5-year projection, a nice 5-year plan, but if the enrollment targets are not met in each year, we're going to continue to have challenges where it's not going to be met. So in my mind, institution advancement has its charge for what it's supposed to bring to the institution for budget purposes, but admissions, and I would dare say financial aid, although they're 2 separate departments, they're inextricably linked, and they have to work together in tandem, especially for packaging students, getting the students to the campus, but more importantly, to make sure that that net tuition revenue is positive and that it's not faltering, that it's not stagnant, and that it's not decreasing, because if those things start to happen, the institution has some other challenges that from the highest level on down they're going to have to address. Next question that's here is, how are institutions going to No, I think I've answered that question already. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I only see 2 questions here. I hope that this presentation was of great use to you, and we are hoping that going forward that what was discussed here today was of some value and of some use to trustees, presidents, senior administrators. In closing, I would say I believe higher education in general is going through what I consider a paradigm shift. I'm no longer working at an HBCU, but HBCUs are in my very DNA. I'm a graduate of Howard University, and I worked at the United Negro College Fund for a number of years, and I worked at an HBCU as a chief financial officer for also a number of years, almost an entire decade. So as I go through and I'm looking at what I see happening and now being on the other side and looking with a different lens, I can see that there's some things in terms of best practices that are out here that MSIs can get into. I can also see that there's some practices around alumni engagement and really getting alumni to understand and sharing in very transparent ways what's happening at our institutions. It is my hope that with all of what's taking place in higher education today, that the newspaper articles that we see about our institutions, that they continue to just be anomalies rather than the norm. But I do believe if we don't take action on some of the things that are before us right now and be more aggressive in terms of some of the changes that have to be made, not only culturally at MSIs, but also financially, then those newspaper articles will become pretty much the norm. So I'm hoping that this this discussion today and the interviews and other avenues that I've been a part of over the last 2 to 3 weeks, that it sparks an interest, that it piques the curiosity of trustees, and for them to seek additional information at their campuses, to pull alongside presidents and senior leaders. As you know, the presidents are the chief executive officers on the campus. So I hope that everyone will take the tenets of this brief and what we discussed here today to heart, and hopefully get back to their campuses and just ask some questions, because our institutions are needed. They fill a very important aspect of the nation's education, higher education sphere, and they are needed, and we just need to do what we can to make sure that they survive. Not only survive, but strive. I know that there might be difference of opinions in direction and strategy and things of that nature, but I'm hoping that individuals will come together and start looking at this in a holistic way, engaging alumni, engaging donor constituents, bringing it together, creating plans, and really, as the topic of the paper said, find ways to navigate this new normal.